Welcome to the Slow Storyteller. Today's story is at level B1 for intermediate learners. Find a comfortable place, relax, and let the words come to you. In a kingdom far to the east, where the forests were dark and the winters were long, a king and queen had waited many years for a child. They had prayed, they had hoped, and at last, on a cold morning in early spring, a daughter was born. The king was so full of joy that he immediately ordered a great celebration. He invited lords and ladies from across the land, and he also invited the fairies of the kingdom to come and bless the new princess. There were 7 fairies in that land, and the king wanted every one of them to give the child a gift. He ordered his servants to prepare 7 golden plates, 7 golden cups, and 7 golden spoons, one set for each fairy guest. The hall was warm and bright on the night of the feast. Candles burned on every table. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread filled the air. The fairies arrived one by one, each wrapped in a shining cloak, each carrying a small gift in her hands. They walked slowly to the cradle where the baby slept, and they leaned down and whispered their blessings. The first fairy gave the princess beauty. The second gave her wisdom. The third gave her grace in dancing. The fourth gave her the ability to sing like a bird. The fifth gave her kindness. The sixth gave her the skill to play any instrument perfectly. But before the 7th fairy could speak, the doors of the hall burst open. Cold air rushed in. The candles near the door shook and went out. Standing in the entrance was an old fairy, a very old fairy that no one had seen in many years. She had not been invited because the king believed she was dead. But she was not dead. She was very much alive, and she was very, very angry. The old fairy walked slowly to the cradle. She looked down at the baby for a long moment. Then she turned to face the room. "I have no golden plate," she said. Her voice was thin and dry, like old leaves in the wind. "I have no golden cup, because no one thought to invite me." The room was completely silent. "Then I will give the child my gift anyway," the old fairy said. "On the day this princess touches the needle of a spinning wheel, she will fall down dead." The king and queen cried out in horror. Several ladies fainted. The old fairy smiled with no warmth at all, turned and walked out into the night. But then the 7th fairy stepped forward. She had been hiding behind a curtain, waiting. She had not yet given her gift, and she had a plan. "I cannot undo what the old fairy has done," she said quietly. "But I can change it. The princess will not die. Instead, when she touches the spinning wheel's needle, she will fall into a deep sleep. She will sleep for 100 years. And at the end of those 100 years, a prince will come and wake her." The king and queen held each other tightly. It was not a happy ending, but it was better than death. The very next morning, the king sent out an order across the entire kingdom. Every spinning wheel must be destroyed. Every spindle, every needle, every thread, all of it must be burned or buried. No spinning wheel could remain in the kingdom. The king believed this would protect his daughter forever. The princess grew up surrounded by beauty and care. She had every gift the fairies had given her. She was gentle, kind, clever, graceful, and wonderfully talented. Every person who met her loved her. She laughed easily and read deeply and walked through the palace gardens every morning just as the sun was rising. She never saw a spinning wheel. She didn't even know what one looked like. But the day came, as the day always does. The princess was 15 years old when she went exploring in a part of the palace she had never visited before. She climbed a narrow staircase at the top of a tower, following a small sound she couldn't identify, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like a heartbeat made of wood. She pushed open a door. Inside the small round room, an old woman sat spinning. The woman was so old and so bent that she looked like a piece of dried wood. She had never heard the king's order. She had been spinning in this room for 60 years, and nobody had told her to stop. "What are you doing?" the princess asked. She was curious, not afraid. I am spinning, my dear, the old woman said. Would you like to try? The princess sat down. She reached out her hand. She touched the needle, and she fell. She did not fall hard. She fell softly, like a leaf falling from a tree in autumn, slowly turning, slowly sinking. Her eyes closed. Her breathing slowed. She slid from the chair, and the old woman caught her gently, though the old woman herself was already falling too, because the seventh fairy's magic spread like water across the whole palace. In the kitchen, the cook fell asleep holding a wooden spoon. In the stable, the horses lay down in the straw. In the garden, the bees stopped moving on the flowers. In the great hall, the king and queen sat down slowly in their chairs and closed their eyes. Every living thing in the palace went to sleep. The dogs, the cats, the birds in their cages, the fire in the hearths. Even the flames bent low and slept without going out. A great forest grew up around the palace. It grew quickly, much faster than any ordinary forest. In a few years, the trees were so tall and so thick that you could not see the palace at all. The thorns were as long as knives, the branches twisted together like locked arms. No light reached the ground beneath those trees. People in the surrounding kingdom told stories about the palace in the forest. Some said a dragon lived there. Some said it was full of ghosts. Parents told their children not to go near the trees. Hunters told each other they had heard strange sounds coming from deep inside. A breathing, they said. A slow, steady breathing, like something enormous sleeping. Years passed, then decades, then generations. 100 years went slowly by. On the last day of the 100th year, a young prince was riding through the countryside near the great dark forest. He was the son of a king from a neighboring land, a good-natured young man who loved adventure, who asked too many questions, and who never quite believed that something was impossible just because people said it was. He stopped his horse at the edge of the forest and looked at the wall of dark trees. An old man on the road nearby had been watching him. "Don't go in there," the old man called out. "What's in there?" the prince asked. The old man thought for a moment. "My grandfather told me a story," he said slowly, "about a palace inside those trees, about a princess who fell asleep inside that palace a very long time ago. He said she was waiting for someone." "Waiting for who?" the prince asked. The old man shrugged. "A prince," he said. "Someone brave enough to go in." The prince looked at the forest for a long moment. The trees were enormous and black. The thorns looked sharp enough to cut through armor. But as he sat there on his horse, something remarkable happened. The branches began to move. Not because of wind. The air was perfectly still. They simply opened. Slowly, the way a crowd parts for someone who is meant to pass through. The trees moved apart and showed him a path. The prince rode in. The path was narrow and the trees were very close on both sides, but nothing touched him. He rode through shadows and silence. He noticed the smell first, old roses, somehow still sweet after 100 years, mixed with something like warm bread, as if the whole palace had been holding its breath and keeping its warmth. Then he saw the towers above the trees. He left his horse at the palace gate and walked inside. Every room was full of sleeping people. He walked through the great hall and saw the king and queen asleep in their thrones, their crowns still straight on their heads. He saw knights asleep in their armor, leaning against the walls. He saw a cat asleep on a windowsill, its paw in the air as if it had been mid-stretch when sleep took it. He saw the cook in the kitchen, still holding the wooden spoon. He even saw a little smile on the cook's face, as if the dream was a very good one. He walked up the stairs. He followed a feeling more than a direction, passing through rooms he had never seen, turning down hallways he had never walked. And at last, he came to a door in a tower. He opened it. She was lying on a small bed near the window. 100 years of sunlight had come and gone through that window, but she looked exactly as she had the moment she fell. Young, still, peaceful. Her dark hair spread across the pillow. Her hands lay open at her sides. The last flower she had ever picked was still lying beside her, dried now, but still holding its shape. The prince knelt beside her. He had never seen anyone so still, and yet she didn't seem dead. She seemed like someone in the middle of a dream. He took her hand. It was warm. He leaned forward and very gently kissed her. Her eyes opened. She looked at him, not with confusion, not with fear, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if she had been expecting exactly this face. "Is it you?" she said softly. "It is," the prince said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was confirming. She sat up slowly. She looked around the room. She looked at the dried flower beside her. She looked at the dust on the windowsill. And then she looked back at the prince. "You took a long time," she said, and smiled. Outside, the whole palace woke up. The cook in the kitchen blinked and continued stirring. The horses stood up in the straw. The fire in the hearth blazed up again. The bees on the flowers moved their wings. The king and queen opened their eyes in the great hall and called for supper, because from their perspective they had simply sat down for a moment. The great forest around the palace thinned slowly, like fog burning off in the morning sun. The prince and the princess talked for a long time that evening. They sat by the window in the tower room while the palace came alive again around them. They spoke carefully at first, strangers who somehow felt they knew each other. But as the candles burned lower and the night deepened, the careful distance between them disappeared. By the time the stars were fully out, they had decided they would be married. The old king's chaplain was found sleeping in the chapel. He had woken with everyone else and simply gone back to his reading, as if 100 years had not passed. He performed the wedding ceremony that very night by candlelight. There were no guests except the princess's old nurse, who wept so much that she had to keep borrowing the chaplain's handkerchief. The prince, however, had a problem. His father's kingdom was far away, and his father was a good king. But his mother, the queen, was different. She was beautiful, certainly. She was intelligent, certainly. She was always polite and well-dressed and perfectly composed. But the prince knew something about his mother that almost no one else knew. Something she kept hidden under all that politeness and all those fine clothes. She was an ogress. Not in the way people sometimes use the word, meaning simply unkind. She was an actual ogress, a creature with deep, old appetites that she had spent her whole royal life controlling. She liked the smell of raw meat. She liked children, but not in the way a grandmother likes children. She liked them the way a wolf likes a rabbit. She had never acted on these appetites, as far as the prince knew. But he did not trust what would happen if he brought home a young wife and eventually young children. So the marriage stayed secret. The prince visited the princess as often as he could. He told his father he was going hunting. His father believed him because the prince did come home sometimes with deer and pheasants. He didn't explain that the hunting was simply what he did on the way. 2 years after the secret wedding, the princess gave birth to a daughter. The child had golden hair and skin the color of early morning. They named her Aurora, which means dawn. A year after that, a son was born. He was a loud, healthy baby with bright eyes that seemed to look at everything with delighted surprise. They named him Day. The children grew up in the palace in the forest, which was now a warm and lively place again. Their mother, the princess, now a young queen in her own right, raised them with the same gentleness she had received. She sang to them. She walked with them in the garden in the mornings. She told them stories in the evenings. The prince visited as often as he could, and each time it was harder to leave. Then, in the 5th year after the secret marriage, the prince's father died. The prince became king of his own kingdom. And now, at last, there was no reason to keep the secret. He rode to the palace in the forest and brought his wife and children home with him. He told his court what had happened. He introduced his queen and his children. Most people were delighted. The young queen was gracious and lovely. The children were healthy and cheerful. But the prince, now the king, watched his mother's face very carefully as she was introduced to Aurora and Day. He saw something move in her eyes, just for a moment. Something old and hungry, like a flame catching in the back of a fireplace. She smiled, but the smile was slow and it spread in the wrong direction. "What beautiful children," she said. The king said nothing. But that night, he lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence of the palace and thinking. A year passed quietly. The king was busy with the duties of his kingdom. There were wars on distant borders to manage, and treaties to sign, and roads to build, and harvests to oversee. He traveled a great deal. He was not always home. His mother, the Queen Mother, was always home. She was kind to her daughter-in-law in all the visible ways. She complimented her at dinner. She gave gifts to the grandchildren. She asked thoughtful questions about the running of the household. She was, to all appearances, a perfect grandmother. But the young queen felt something she couldn't explain. It was a coldness that didn't come from the temperature of any room. It was a certain quality in the Queen Mother's eyes when she looked at the children, an attentiveness, too focused, too still, like a cat watching a bird through glass. She said nothing to her husband because she had no words for it, only a feeling. The king went away on a long campaign to the eastern border. It was expected to last several months. He said goodbye to his wife and children in the cold gray dawn of a November morning, and he rode away with his soldiers, and the palace gate closed behind him. The Queen Mother waited 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she called for the head cook and told him to prepare her lunch. "I would like," she said, in the same calm tone she used to order soup, "to eat little Aurora." The cook, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas, who had been cooking for the royal family for 30 years, went very still. "Your Majesty?" he said. "The child," the Queen Mother said. "Aurora. She is 4 years old, and she will be tender. Prepare her with a sauce of mustard and vinegar. I'll take lunch in the small dining room." Thomas looked at her. She looked back at him without any expression at all. He bowed. He went to the kitchen. He closed the door. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. Thomas was not a brave man. He was a cook. He was very good at sauces and roasted meats and pastry, but he was not trained for moments like this. His hands were shaking. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of bread baking, and it seemed deeply wrong that something normal like bread could be baking, while something so terrible was being asked of him. He thought for a long time. Then he made a decision. He went to find the young queen. He found her in the garden, walking with the children in the thin winter sunlight. Aurora was chasing a bird. Day was attempting, seriously and without success, to catch a falling leaf. Thomas told the young queen everything, very quietly, while the children played. She went pale as milk. She stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at Thomas and she said, "What do we do?" "I have a small house," Thomas said, "in the village beyond the forest. My wife is there. The children will be safe with her. I will hide them tonight, and I will tell the Queen Mother that I have done as she asked." "And what will you serve her?" the queen asked. "A young goat," Thomas said, "prepared carefully. She will not know the difference." Thomas moved the children that night, wrapping them in thick wool blankets and carrying them through the cold dark on a cart covered with straw. They thought it was an adventure. Aurora asked questions the whole way. Day fell asleep before they reached the edge of the village. Thomas's wife was a small, practical woman named Marie who asked exactly 2 questions. "Are they in danger?" And, "Are they healthy?" When Thomas said yes and yes, she simply made up 2 beds near the fire, put bread and warm milk on the table, and set about the business of keeping two small children safe, as if it were no different from any other task. Thomas went back to the palace. He served the Queen Mother a roasted young goat with mustard sauce and vinegar in the small dining room. She ate it slowly, with apparent pleasure, looking out the window at the winter garden. "It is even better than I imagined," she said. "I am glad your Majesty is pleased," Thomas said. A month later, she called for him again. "And we must be very careful." Hugo was quiet for a moment. His large hands rested on the wooden table in front of him. Then he nodded slowly. "Leave it to me, Your Majesty," he said. "Leave it entirely to me." The next morning, Hugo told the Queen Mother that the dish was ready. He carried it to her rooms himself, a beautifully presented plate with rich sauce, herbs, and tender meat. The Queen Mother ate every piece. She nodded with deep satisfaction. "Excellent," she said. "Quite perfect." She did not know that what she had eaten was a young lamb from the royal farms. Aurora was hidden safely in the cook's own house, at the edge of the palace grounds, under the care of Hugo's wife. A week passed. Then the Queen Mother called the new queen again. "I want to eat day now," she said. She was already looking at her fingernails, as though the matter was already decided. The queen kept her face perfectly still. "Of course," she said. She went again to Hugo. Once more, he nodded. Once more, he carried a beautiful plate to the Queen Mother's rooms. This time, it was a young goat, very tender, with a different sauce. The Queen Mother ate with great pleasure. "Even better than the first time," she said. "My compliments to the cook." Day was now also hidden in Hugo's house. He slept beside his sister on a narrow bed, while Hugo's wife told them quiet stories and kept the fire burning low and warm. 2 weeks later, the Queen Mother called the new queen for the third time. "Now," she said, "I shall eat the queen." She said it the same way she had said the other things, pleasantly, calmly, as if it were a perfectly reasonable request. This time, the queen felt something she had not felt before in that room, something close to despair. She was not afraid for herself. She was afraid for her children, alone in Hugo's house. She was afraid that without her, no one would protect them fully. But she walked to the kitchen again. Hugo listened. His round face was very serious. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he looked at the queen and said, "It will be all right, Your Majesty. Trust me." He sent a message to his wife. He made his arrangements. That night, the Queen Mother received her third magnificent plate, this time with a sauce of rosemary and dark wine. She was enormously satisfied. She sat back in her great chair and smiled at the ceiling. "Gone," she said softly. "All gone. Peace at last." But Hugo was only human. He could cook and he could hide and he could protect, but he could not control every person in the palace. One of the Queen Mother's personal servants had been watching. She had grown suspicious. She had counted the plates going in and out. She had noted that neither the children nor the queen had been seen for weeks. She went to the Queen Mother in the evening. She spoke quietly, apologetically, with her eyes on the floor. The Queen Mother listened without expression. Then she stood up very slowly from her chair. "Bring Hugo to me," she said. Hugo came. He stood before the Queen Mother in her great hall. He was not a small man, but she seemed, in that moment, larger than the room. Her voice was very quiet, much quieter than anger usually sounds. "You lied to me," she said. Hugo said nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides. He did not look afraid, exactly, but he looked like a man who knew that what came next could not be avoided. "Where are they?" said the Queen Mother. Hugo said nothing. The Queen Mother made a decision. She ordered a large wooden container, a kind of trough, to be brought to the middle of the courtyard. It was filled with the most dangerous and horrible things she could gather: snakes from the garden wall, enormous toads from the wet places near the river, scorpions, and other creatures that bite and sting and poison. She stood beside this terrible trough and gave her order. Hugo, the queen, and the two children would all be thrown in together. Hugo was brought first. He stood at the edge and looked in. Then the servants went to his house to find the queen and the children. And in that exact moment, as the servants were running across the palace grounds and the queen mother was standing in the cold courtyard beside her terrible pit, the sound of horse hooves rang on the cobblestones outside the palace gates. The king had returned. No one had expected him so soon. The war had ended quickly, more quickly than anyone had planned. He had ridden hard for 3 days to get home, stopping only when his horse needed water. He rode through the gates. He saw the trough in the middle of the courtyard. He saw the terrible creatures inside it. He saw his cook standing at the edge. He saw his mother standing beside it, her black robe moving in the cold wind, her face turned toward him with an expression that mixed fury and something else, something that was almost relief. "What is this?" said the king. His voice was very quiet, quieter than anger usually sounds. A silence fell over the courtyard. Nobody moved. Then Hugo spoke. He spoke clearly, standing at the edge of the trough, and he told the king everything: the meals, the hiding, the queen, the children, all of it. His voice was steady throughout, even when he described the things the queen mother had eaten with so much satisfaction. The king listened. His face went through several changes: disbelief, then grief, then fury, then something cold and still. The queen mother watched her son's face. She had lived a very long time. She had survived many things. But she saw something in his eyes in that moment that she recognized as irreversible. And perhaps because she was very old and had been fighting her hunger for so many decades and was tired, deeply, completely tired, she chose not to run. She stepped backward. She stepped into the trough herself. The creatures inside were fast and merciless. The queen mother fell, and she did not get up. The king stood at the edge for a long moment. Then he turned away. Hugo's wife heard the horses first. She had been awake for hours, sitting near the fire with a candle, listening to every sound. When she heard the commotion in the courtyard, the voices, the shouting, the silence, she pressed her ear to the door. Then she heard something else: the king's voice, calling his wife's name. She opened the door. The queen appeared in the doorway, real, unhurt, with dark eyes that were tired but warm. She looked at Hugo's wife for a moment and said simply, "Thank you." Then she walked out into the pale morning light. The king was crossing the palace grounds on foot. He had left his horse. He was walking fast, almost running. When he saw her, he stopped. They stood 10 steps apart in the gray morning. The air smelled of cold stone and something faintly floral, the first blossoms of spring trying to come through the frost. Then she walked to him, and he walked to her. And there was no speech for a long time. Aurora and Day were brought out next, still half asleep, their hair tangled, their eyes blinking in the morning light. Day complained immediately about being hungry, which made 3 servants laugh despite themselves. Aurora took her father's hand quietly and held it for a very long time. Inside the palace, life began again. Fires were lit, bread was baked, the great hall was opened and aired out. The smell of cold and emptiness gave way to warmth and food and voices. Hugo stood in his kitchen and cooked breakfast. An enormous breakfast: eggs and bread and cheese and preserved fruit and strong hot tea. He arranged it beautifully, as he arranged everything. He carried it to the queen's room himself. She thanked him. He bowed and turned to leave. "Hugo," she said. He stopped. "You were very brave," she said. "You protected my children. You protected me. There will be no way to thank you properly, but we will try." Hugo looked at the floor. His round face was a little red. He cleared his throat. "It is my job," he said gruffly. I am the royal cook. The royal family must be fed and cared for. He paused, and they should not be eaten. The queen smiled, a real, full smile, the kind that reached her eyes. No, she agreed, they should not. Hugo nodded, satisfied. He left. In the days that followed, the king sat in his great chair in the hall and attended to the business of his kingdom. He signed documents and received visitors and listened to reports from his generals. He did all the things a king is required to do. But in the evenings, when the work was done, he went to the rooms where his wife and children lived. He sat by the fire and listened to Aurora play the harp. She had her mother's gift for music, and the sound she made was like water over smooth stone. Day sat on the floor and tried to teach the royal dogs new tricks, with mixed results and a great deal of noise. The queen sat beside the fire and worked on a piece of embroidery. Her hands were steady and her face was peaceful. One evening, the king said quietly, "I am sorry I left." The queen looked up from her embroidery. "You had no choice," she said. "There was a war." "I should have seen what she was," he said. The queen was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled between them. Aurora played something soft and slow on the harp. "You loved her," the queen said finally. "That is not something to apologize for." The king looked at his wife. He thought about the 100 years she had slept, all those years of waiting that she had no knowledge of, years that simply did not exist for her. He thought about how she had stood in the tower room and looked at him with those calm, dark eyes, and said, "Is it you?" As though she had always known he was coming. He thought that perhaps people who have slept through difficult times come out the other side with something that others do not have, a kind of patience, a kind of peace that does not break easily. "You are extraordinary," he said. The queen looked back at her embroidery. Her expression was modest and thoughtful. "I had very good help," she said. And from the kitchen far below, as if on cue, they heard the tremendous crash of Hugo dropping an enormous pot, followed by a burst of colorful language that was absolutely not appropriate for a royal palace, and then the laughter of the kitchen staff. Aurora stopped playing. Day looked up from the dogs. The king and queen looked at each other, and they both laughed. The kind of laughter that is full of relief and warmth and the simple joy of being alive and together and safe. The kind of laughter that fills a room and leaves something good behind, like the smell of bread or the warmth of a good fire. Outside, the last light of the evening touched the tops of the trees in the great forest. The thorns that had grown for 100 years had all fallen now. They had disappeared the morning the princess woke up, as quietly as they had grown. In their place, ordinary trees stood, ordinary and peaceful, with birds in their branches and wind moving through their leaves. The old castle in the forest was empty now. But sometimes, on very still nights, the servants who had slept there for 100 years said they could still smell something. The faint ghost of roasting meat and candle wax, hanging in the cool air like a memory. And they smiled. Because all memories are not sad. Some are simply old. And old things, in the right light, can be beautiful. That is how the story ends. Not with a great battle or a final curse broken by magic, but with laughter in a warm room, and bread in the oven, and a child's hands on the strings of a harp, and the whole long, strange, difficult, wonderful story, settling like a sleeping kingdom, quietly, slowly, into peace. That's the end of today's story. But before we go, what are the key words we learned today? Let's review the 10 most useful words from this story. 1. Curse, a magical spell meant to cause harm to someone. 2. Spindle, the sharp needle on a spinning wheel. Blessing, a gift or good wish, especially from someone with power. 4. Enchanted, under the effect of a magical spell. 5. Devoted, completely loyal and caring towards someone. 6. Ogress, A female monster in old stories that eats humans. 7. Despair, a deep feeling of hopelessness with no way out. 8. Irreversible, impossible to change or undo. 9. Commotion, a sudden loud noise and confused activity. 10. Modest, not boastful, quiet, about one's own qualities. Thank you for listening to The Slow Storyteller. Slow stories, real English, every week. If today's story helped you, please subscribe so you don't miss next week's. Until then, keep listening, keep learning,